The envelope arrived at his rural route address in the summer of 2013, and he opened it the same way he opened everything. Standing at the kitchen counter, late afternoon, still in his work clothes. It was addressed to Gulf Coast Seafood Processing, Inc., Facility Manager, 14 Cannery Road, Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. Someone at the facility had transposed the last 2 digits of their postal route number when filing the annual discharge compliance report with the EPA's Region 6 office. The mailing went to Rural Route 7, Box 224, which was Wendell Ubre's address. It had been sitting in his box for 3 days. The letter was from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. It was a compliance documentation request. It referenced Gulf Coast Seafood Processing's 2013 Annual Discharge Compliance Report and asked the facility to provide supplemental documentation for 3 line items that did not match the discharge monitoring records on file in the agency's database. The letter cited specific dates, specific volumes, and specific chemical parameters: ammonia, nitrogen, biological oxygen demand, suspended solids, that had been reported by the facility as within permitted limits, but that the agency's own monitoring data suggested were not. Wendell read it once. He read it again. He was 69 years old. He had been watching Gulf Coast Seafood Processing operate from Dero, 4 miles to the west, for 16 years. He had been filing complaints about the contamination since 2009. He had received acknowledgement letters and review queue notices and 1 phone call from a DEQ case officer who had asked him to be patient and whom he had thanked and hung up. He had 4 years of water test results in his desk drawer and a map that a retired extension agent had drawn in March of 2009, and that no one at any agency had yet found sufficient reason to act on. The letter in his hand was not addressed to him. It was addressed to the cannery. It had been delivered to him because someone at the facility had transposed 2 digits on a postal route form. It was a compliance documentation request from the EPA asking the facility to explain why its self-reported discharge figures did not match the agency's own monitoring data. He read it a 3rd time. Then he set it on the counter. He went to his truck and drove to the cannery. He gave the letter to the woman at the front desk and told her it had been delivered to his address in error. She thanked him. He drove home. He had made a photocopy before he left. His name was Wendell James Ubre, and he was 69 years old, and he had come to the land in Terrebonne Parish through pure stubbornness and nothing else. He had grown up in Houma, the son of a sheet metal worker who died young, one of 5 children in a household that had always had just enough and never more than that. He had worked since he was 14 years old. Summers on shrimp boats, weekends at a crawfish wholesale operation on the intracoastal, and after high school, a decade of irregular marine labor that took him along the Gulf Coast from Houma to Port Arthur and back again without ever resolving into anything permanent. He was 34 years old before he decided that the irregular had gone on long enough. He found the 74 acres on Bayou Crochet Road in Terrebonne Parish in 1988. It was the worst bottomland in the parish. Low, wet, prone to flooding, with a creek running through the south end that backed up in heavy rain and stayed backed up for weeks. Neighbors had watched 3 different owners fail on that ground in 20 years. The current seller had tried to graze cattle on it for 6 years and given up. Wendell walked it twice before he made an offer. He walked it once in dry season to understand its contours, and once after a rain to understand what the water did. He paid $41,000 for it, which he had saved over 10 years of working boats. Every dollar from every boat run, every off-season job, every season he had lived on, less than he could have spent. He understood from those walks that he was not buying good land. He was buying the chance to make bad land into something. That was what he had available. He was not going to wait for something better to appear. He spent the first 4 years draining it. Clay drainage tile, a pump station on the south end, a levee along the bayou bank. He did the work himself, mostly, with equipment he borrowed from a cousin and later from neighbors who had come to trust that borrowed equipment came back in better condition than it left. By 1992, the land was farmable. By 1995, he had 2 crawfish ponds producing reliably and a 12-acre vegetable plot on the higher ground to the north, running sweet potatoes and okra and the occasional row of hot peppers that he sold at the Homa Farmers Market on Saturday mornings. It was not a large operation. It was not going to make him wealthy. But it was his. And it was producing. And it was on ground that the parish had written off and that he had refused to write off. And that distinction mattered to him in a way he did not spend much time articulating. Gulf Coast Seafood Processing broke ground, 4 miles to the west in 1997. Wendell watched the construction from his levee road and thought nothing particular about it. Fish processing was the industry of the parish. He had worked fish processing. He understood that it employed people and that it smelled and that it generated waste in quantities that required managing. He was not opposed to it. The first deposit appeared in the spring of 2004 on the west boundary of his property, where the drainage from the Cannery's parking area met the low ground near his fence. It was fish scrap, heads, entrails, shell fragments, maybe a cubic yard, dumped or washed from the Cannery's overflow drainage during a heavy rain event. He noted it. He thought it was a one-time occurrence. It was not a one-time occurrence. By 2006, Wendell's South Crawfish Pond was producing at 40% of its 2003 yield. By 2008, it had stopped producing entirely. He had spent $14,000 on aerators, water testing, and restocking between 2005 and 2008, and the pond had continued to decline regardless. The water had a particular quality he could not name precisely. A chemistry, something in the clarity and the smell and the way the crawfish behaved in the weeks before a die-off. That did not match any natural cause he knew from 15 years of working the ponds. His north pond was declining more slowly, but declining. By 2009, his crawfish revenue had dropped from $67,000 annually to $11,000. That was the year he called Dewey Harp. Dewey Harp was 74 years old, retired from the LSU Ag Center after 31 years as a soil and water quality specialist in Terrebonne Parish. He had been the agent who told Wendell in 1992 that the drainage tile would work at sufficient grade. That advice had been correct. Wendell trusted it because it had a 17-year track record. Dewey drove out on a Tuesday in March of 2009. He walked the fence line, the drainage channels, both pond banks. He took water samples from 9 locations and sent them to a commercial water quality lab in Baton Rouge. He also drew something on graph paper he had brought in a cardboard tube. The drawing was a contamination plat, a hand-drawn map of the 74-acre property and the 0 to 4 mile corridor between the Cannery and Bayou Crochet. He marked 14 distinct deposit or discharge locations, noted the waste type at each, fish scrap, shell waste, processing effluent, and drew drainage flow lines to the creek. Alongside each location, he recorded ammonia-nitrogen concentrations estimated with commercial test strips, pH, visual turbidity, black ink for the plat lines, red for the contamination measurements. He labeled it Ubra Property, Terrebonne Parish. Water Quality Assessment, March 2009. He signed it. He gave it to Wendell when the lab results came back 3 weeks later. He said, "The ammonia levels in the South Drainage Channel are 34 times the state freshwater standard. The Bayou crossing is at 12 times. He looked at the map. He said, "This is not from your ponds, Wendell. This is coming from their side." Wendell looked at the map. He asked one question. He said, "What do I do with this?" Dewey said, You file a complaint with the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, and you keep a copy of everything. Wendell filed the complaint in April of 2009. Pacific Rim Food Holdings, which had acquired the facility the previous year, responded through attorneys. The facility's discharge practices were fully compliant, and any contamination on adjacent properties was attributable to natural drainage patterns in the parish. The response was 22 pages. It cited a water quality consultant who had spent 4 hours on site. Dewey Harp had spent 14. The consultant had taken 3 water samples. Dewey had taken 9. The DEQ put the matter in a review queue. It stayed there for 2 years. Wendell rolled the map back into the cardboard tube after Dewey left and put it in the desk drawer in his farmhouse study, the same drawer where he kept his water test records and his crawfish yield logs. He did not put it in a folder. He put it in the tube, the way Dewey had brought it, with Dewey's signature on the outside. He kept a photocopy in a separate envelope. He also kept filing. Every year from 2009 through 2012, he sent a supplemental complaint update to the DEQ with the latest water test results and his crawfish yield figures, a running record of what the contamination had cost him, year by year, pond by pond, in numbers that could be compared against his pre-2004 production logs. He sent copies to the EPA's Region 6 office in Dallas. He received acknowledgement letters. He received requests for additional information, which he provided within 10 days of each request, every time. He received referrals to other state agencies, which he followed up on with the same patience. He drove to Baton Rouge twice for in-person meetings with agency staff who were, he understood, working through larger caseloads than they had resources to handle. He did not make their jobs harder. He made them easier by providing clean, organized documentation that required no follow-up questions. He was not loud about any of this. He was persistent the way a man is persistent when he has decided that the correct answer to bureaucratic delay is more documentation, not more anger. There is a specific kind of discipline in that approach. In continuing to file the paperwork and attend the meetings and provide the records without knowing when or whether they will matter. And it is rarer than most people understand. He was also still farming. The South Pond was dead. The North Pond, marginal. He had shifted to a larger vegetable operation, 6 additional acres of sweet potatoes, expanded pepper rows, a small stand of satsuma trees on the north end that he had put in on a hunch and that were beginning to produce. His revenue in 2012 was $34,000. It had been $91,000 in 2003. He kept the lights on. He kept filing. The photocopied EPA letter sat in a separate envelope in the same drawer for 4 months before he sent copies to his DEQ case officer and to the EPA's Region 6 Enforcement Division. He had included a cover note, 2 sentences. This compliance request was misfiled to my address. The discrepancies it references are consistent with what my water testing has documented since 2009. The EPA's Region 6 Enforcement Division opened a file on October 3, 2013. The federal courtroom was in the Eastern District of Louisiana, in New Orleans. Judge Marie Toureau had been on the bench for 21 years. She had reviewed the pleadings and the evidence submissions before the trial date. She arrived exactly on time. Pacific Rim Food Holdings' legal team consisted of 5 attorneys from a New Orleans firm with a specialized environmental practice. Their lead counsel was a man named Gregory Arsenault, 48 years old, 19 years in federal environmental litigation, confident in the factual record as his client had provided it. He had 2 associates and a consultant's expert report that challenged the methodology of the contamination data. Wendell sat with an attorney named Sylvia Broussard, who had handled Clean Water Act cases in the Eastern District for 17 years. She had the full record, 4 years of water test results, 4 years of DEQ complaint filings, and the EPA's own enforcement investigation documents, including the agency's 2014 testing protocol, which had covered every location Dewey Harp had marked on the 2009 map. She placed the map on the evidence table. She placed the EPA's 2014 testing report beside it. She did not introduce them simultaneously. She introduced the map first. Dewey Harp's hand-drawn contamination plat. March 2009, 14 locations, ammonia nitrate measurements in red ink. And let the judge examine it for a long time. Then she placed the EPA report alongside it, open to the table of results for the same 14 locations. Tested 5 years later with federal laboratory equipment. The EPA's measurements confirmed Dewey Harp's field estimates to within 4%. At 11 of 14 locations, the confirmation was within 2%. Dewey Harp had died on March 14, 2017. He was 82 years old. He had been told about the federal case in 2015 and had provided a written declaration confirming his methodology. He did not live to hear the verdict. Judge Tarode looked at both documents for a long time. Then she looked at Gregory Arsenault. She said, "Counsel, your client's discharge compliance reports for the years 2004 through 2012 recorded ammonia nitrogen outputs at this facility's permitted limits or below." Arsenault said, "That is correct, Your Honor," she said. The EPA's own monitoring station at the Bayou Crochet confluence recorded ammonia nitrogen levels at 12 times the state standard during that same period. Is your client's position that the facility's compliance reports and the EPA's monitoring data are consistent? Arsenault said, "Your Honor, our position is that the sources of contamination at the Bayou confluence are not attributable solely," she said. "I'm asking about the compliance reports." Arsenault said nothing for a moment. She waited. The room waited. He said, "There may have been reporting irregularities." The room was very quiet. Arsenault said, "There may have been reporting irregularities in certain periods." The judge looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the map. Then she looked at the EPA report. Then she looked at the dates. March 2009, when Dewey Harp had walked the drainage channels with commercial test strips and graph paper. November 2014, when EPA field teams had covered the same 14 locations with federal laboratory equipment. She had been on the bench for 21 years. She had seen a great deal of expert testimony and a great deal of field documentation. She had rarely seen field documentation from a retired extension agent confirmed at that level of precision by a federal agency's own investigation. She made a note. She looked at both parties. She said, "We'll recess until Monday for closing arguments." Judgment was entered for Wendell Uber on November 8, 2017. Gulf Coast Seafood Processing was found liable under Clean Water Act Section 301 for unlawful discharge into Bayou Crochet over a period of not less than 9 years. Civil penalties to the United States: $2, $1 million. Damages to Wendell Ubre, $611,000, comprising $218,000 in documented crawfish revenue loss and $393,000 in mandated remediation costs payable by the Cannery directly. The remediation, soil excavation, replacement, and full restoration of both ponds and the drainage system was to be completed within 18 months under EPA supervision. Pacific Rim Food Holdings filed a notice of appeal. It was withdrawn 6 months later. The remediated land, when restoration was complete in the spring of 2019, was assessed by the parish at $347,000. Wendell had paid $41,000 for it in 1988. He had not expected, when he bought it, that it would ever be worth that. He did not learn the final assessment figure until the parish notice arrived in the mail. He read it at the kitchen counter the same way he read everything. He set it down. He went to the study. The cardboard tube was in the desk drawer, where it had always been, beside the crawfish yield logs and the water test envelopes. He opened the tube and unrolled the map on the desk. It was worn at the edges from being rolled and unrolled. Dewey's red measurements were still legible. His signature at the bottom, D. Harp, March 2009. The date was 10 years and a month ago. Wendell looked at the map for a while. He looked at Dewey's handwriting. The small, methodical print of a man who had spent 31 years writing things down in the field, because writing things down in the field is how you make what you observe mean something later. He looked at the 14 locations. He looked at the red numbers. He thought about a Tuesday in March of 2009. A man with a cardboard tube and a box of commercial test strips, walking every foot of a contaminated drainage channel and recording what he saw. He rolled the map back into the tube. He capped it. He put it back in the drawer. He went outside. The south pond was full, restocked the previous fall, running at 40% of its pre-2004 yield and climbing. The water was clear. Bayou Crochet ran along the south boundary the way it had always run before 2004. Moving, oxygenated, the color of water that has not been asked to hold more than it can carry. He stood at the bank for a while. He had stood at this bank in 2008 and watched the crawfish die and had not fully known then what he was looking at or what it would take to undo it. He knew now. It had taken a retired extension agent with graph paper, 9 years of filing, a misfiled envelope, and a federal judge who had spent 21 years learning what field documentation looks like when it is honest. Dewey had known it was honest. He had walked every foot of it himself. Wendell stood at the bank a little longer. Then he walked back to the house to start the evening work. Wendell Oubre was not the only landowner Gulf Coast Seafood Processing had treated this way. There were 3 others, all within 2 miles of the facility, all with the same years of contamination, all still waiting to understand what had happened to their water. Those stories are coming. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Next time, a man named Silas Pruitt, 77 years old, a timber company, and a road his grandfather built in 1938 under terms the county forgot to read. We'll see you there.